April 23, 1945, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. The morning air was thick with the smell of oil, leather, and determination. Rows of young American women stood on the parade ground, their boots sinking slightly into the red clay soil. They weren't secretaries, nurses, or typists today. They were soldiers, and they were about to do something the world had rarely seen before. Nearby, behind the barbed wire of a well-guarded prisoner camp, a small group of Japanese prisoners of war watched in silence. Their faces, hardened by years of battle and defeat, were unreadable. But behind those steady eyes something was stirring: disbelief. They had come from an empire where a woman's place was in the home, where the idea of a female soldier was almost unthinkable. Yet here, in the heart of America, they were watching women march beside men, step for step, shoulder to shoulder, equal in every way. The women belonged to the Women's Army Corps, known proudly as the WACs. Created in 1942 by the United States Army, the WAC opened a new chapter in history, one where courage, discipline, and patriotism had no gender. When the Japanese POWs first arrived in the U.S., many were stunned by what they saw. Their captors, the American soldiers, were not cruel or boastful. They were organized, polite, and efficient. But what truly left them speechless were the women. These weren't the quiet, obedient figures the prisoners were accustomed to. These were women who wore uniforms, carried rifles, and commanded respect. As the bugles sounded across the camp that April morning, the Japanese prisoners leaned closer to the fence. In perfect formation, the WACs moved forward, their rifles glinting under the Georgia sun. The commanding officer, Captain Mary Louise O'Brien, shouted orders with a confidence that echoed across the field. Eyes front. Forward march. And they marched, crisp, powerful, precise. Every movement told a story of strength and pride. These women weren't here for show. They had trained hard, learning navigation, first aid, mechanics, communications, and even marksmanship. Many had volunteered knowing full well they might be stationed near battle zones. For the Japanese POWs, the scene was almost beyond comprehension. In their culture, the army was sacred, a place reserved only for men. Yet here were American women treated not as decoration, but as defenders of their nation. One of the prisoners, a former naval officer named Katsuo Nakamura, later wrote in his post-war memoir, "When I saw women in uniform training like men, I realized America's power did not come only from weapons, but from the heart of its people." It wasn't arrogance, it was unity. Every soldier, male or female, believed in the same flag, the same mission, and the same freedom worth protecting. Throughout that spring, the WACs of Fort Oglethorpe became a living symbol of that unity. They worked alongside male soldiers in logistics, signal operations, and intelligence. Some even prepared for deployment overseas. The Japanese prisoners watched with a mix of awe and quiet respect. What they didn't know was that across the country, over 150,000 American women had already joined the Women's Army Corps. They repaired jeeps, decoded enemy messages, managed supplies, and operated radios that kept the Allied front moving. For every bomb dropped, every tank rolled, and every troop advanced, there was a woman ensuring the mission ran smoothly behind the lines. And the U.S. Army, proud and forward-thinking, trusted them completely. The Japanese POWs couldn't stop talking about what they saw. Word spread from camp to camp. American women train with men, they whispered, and the men respect them. For men raised in a society built on hierarchy and silence, it was a revelation. They began to realize that the strength of America wasn't only in its technology or its vast resources. It was in the way it believed in every citizen, man or woman, to serve the cause of freedom. That day in April wasn't just another training drill. It was a turning point, a quiet revolution playing out under the southern sun, witnessed by the very men who once fought to destroy the nation now housing them. They came as prisoners, but what they saw that morning would stay with them forever. September 12, 1945, Guam, Mariana Islands. The Pacific War was over. Battleships now sat quietly in the harbors, their guns at rest, and thousands of captured Japanese soldiers waited in fenced compounds surrounded by palm trees and coral sand. The surrender had come swiftly and painfully, but what happened afterward surprised the prisoners more than any defeat on the battlefield. That morning, a transport truck rumbled through the camp gates carrying a group of new personnel, American soldiers in crisp khaki uniforms. Among them were women. The Japanese prisoners pressed against the wire, murmuring to one another. They had heard rumors of American lady soldiers, but few believed it until now. Leading the convoy was Lieutenant Eleanor Baker, a U.S. Army nurse turned field medic who had volunteered for post-war relief duty. She had served in Saipan during the worst bombing raids and now commanded a mixed team of male and female medics assigned to treat the wounded, American and Japanese alike. Her presence alone challenged every idea the prisoners carried from home. Under the tropical heat, the team began setting up a medical tent. When one of the Japanese POWs collapsed from dehydration, it was Lieutenant Baker who knelt beside him, checking his pulse, giving him water, and speaking softly through an interpreter. Around her, male orderlies followed her instructions with precision. To the watching prisoners, the sight was nothing short of astonishing. An American woman commanding soldiers, her voice calm, her authority unquestioned. One prisoner whispered, "She speaks and they listen." Another answered, "She is stronger than many men." Throughout September, similar scenes unfolded across the Pacific camps. The U.S. Army's discipline never wavered, even in victory. The same soldiers who had fought ferocious battles were now delivering medicine, rebuilding shelters, and enforcing strict codes of respect toward every prisoner. For many Japanese captives, it was their first experience of mercy from an occupying force. What impressed them most was how the women carried themselves, not boastfully, not vengefully, but with quiet confidence. They were living proof that strength could coexist with compassion. At Camp Susup on Saipan, Japanese officers watched as a group of WAC signal operators installed communication lines between the camp hospital and the port. These women carried heavy coils of wire on their shoulders, sweating under the island sun, laughing as they worked. When one line snapped, they fixed it in minutes. A Japanese lieutenant, once an engineer, observed carefully and later told an American guard, "In my country we teach women to serve men. Here you teach women to serve their nation." Each evening, when the tropical light faded, the prisoners heard music drifting from the American compound. Harmonica tunes, sometimes a portable record player spinning soft swing melodies. To them it was surreal. Their captors sang, women's voices blending with men's, not as entertainment but as routine morale. That simple harmony struck the prisoners more deeply than any weapon had. Every few days, small groups of POWs were marched to clean nearby beaches of debris left by the war. The guards who supervised them included both male and female MPs. None carried hatred in their eyes. The female guards enforced discipline firmly yet fairly, addressing prisoners by number and task, never insult or slur. Over time, even the most defiant captives began greeting them with respectful nods. One historian later described this period as America's quiet victory. The U.S. Army had shown the world that justice could be strong without cruelty, and mercy could stand beside power. On September 26, Lieutenant Baker organized a field clinic where Japanese prisoners were taught basic hygiene and wound care, so they could help one another. Dozens volunteered. When she finished explaining through an interpreter, several prisoners bowed deeply, a gesture rarely given to outsiders. It was gratitude, not submission. That night, a tropical storm swept across Guam. Tents collapsed, power lines fell, and rain flooded the compound. The next morning, American soldiers and female medics waded through ankle-deep mud repairing what the storm had destroyed. Prisoners joined in side by side. For the first time, there was no division, only humans working together under the same sky. Afterward, an American sergeant wrote home, "They see now that our women serve with courage. Maybe that will teach them something greater than war ever could." By October's end, the once defiant prisoners had changed. They no longer whispered about defeat. They talked about the things they'd witnessed. The women who commanded respect, the soldiers who showed mercy, the country that believed everyone could serve a purpose. When transport ships later carried them home, many would tell their families stories that sounded impossible. Stories of American female soldiers training beside men, leading teams, saving lives. Some of their listeners laughed in disbelief. But the witnesses knew what they had seen. In that humid, war-scarred corner of the Pacific, the Japanese POWs had learned their final lesson. Strength is not only in might, but in equality, discipline, and humanity. December 1945, Tokyo Bay. The harbor lay still beneath the winter haze. American ships floated where once Japanese battleships had ruled, their decks lined with sailors watching a nation rebuild itself from ashes. Far from the noise of surrender ceremonies, quiet conversations began to ripple through the newly opened ports. Stories carried home by returning prisoners of war. They spoke not of humiliation but of astonishment, of what they had seen inside the camps of America. In the towns of Yokosuka, Kagoshima, and Sapporo, families gathered around small charcoal stoves as former soldiers described the impossible. American women in uniform training with men, commanding respect, working shoulder to shoulder in the same ranks. At first, few believed them. Japan's own women had lived decades behind paper screens, bound by silence and duty. To imagine them marching beside men seemed absurd. But the stories persisted. Letters filtered through the occupation censors. Accounts written in careful words by men who had been prisoners in Alabama, in Guam, in the dusty fields of Georgia. They described soldiers who treated them firmly but fairly, and women who led with confidence, knowledge, and calm. One former naval engineer told his wife, their strength was not from hatred. It was from unity. She wept quietly. It was the first time she had heard her husband speak of the enemy with respect. In Tokyo, the U.S. Army's occupation forces had established new administrative headquarters. Alongside the reconstruction of bridges and ports came a different kind of rebuilding, one of ideas. The American command believed that for Japan to stand again, it must first learn equality and discipline through justice. Many of those lessons were taught not only by generals but by the quiet presence of American women serving in the occupation. Clerks, nurses, and military police officers who walked the same streets once guarded by imperial troops. Everywhere they went, eyes followed them. Schoolgirls whispered. Older men bowed awkwardly, uncertain how to address them. Yet over time the sight became ordinary. The American female uniform, the olive jacket, the brimmed cap, the polished boots, became a symbol of order rather than fear. Historians later noted that the post-war reforms which granted Japanese women the right to vote and hold public office were influenced, in part, by what the occupation authorities had modeled. The example was visible. Women respected as professionals inside one of the world's most disciplined armies. The Japanese press, newly freed from censorship, published photographs of American WACs working in Yokohama hospitals and communication centers. For the first time, Japanese readers saw women soldering radio lines, teaching English to orphans, and coordinating medical deliveries for entire prefectures. To a nation struggling to understand defeat, the image was unsettling yet inspiring. The former enemy had shown a different kind of victory, the victory of structure, mercy, and inclusion. One article in the Asahi Shimbun in early 1946 described an American nurse treating malnourished children in a ruined village. The writer noted, "She commands her men with patience. The soldiers obey without hesitation. Such harmony is strength." Those words would have been unthinkable only a year before. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army maintained its standards. Orders were clear: treat every civilian with dignity, maintain discipline, rebuild without revenge. The efficiency of the military government astonished many Japanese administrators. They observed women running supply depots, organizing logistics for food distribution, and training local staff. It was military order turned toward peace. The stories the POWs had brought home were no longer isolated memories, they had become proof. Proof that the nation that defeated Japan was not driven by cruelty, but by confidence rooted in equality. The contrast struck deeply. By the spring of 1946, a quiet respect began to replace resentment. Children waved to passing American convoys, some even saluted. Their parents, once fearful, saw in the conduct of U.S. soldiers, men and women alike, a discipline that could rebuild nations, not just win wars. Across the Pacific, the United States continued its demobilization, but the impression it left in Japan endured. For those who had once been enemies, the memory of American women training beside men remained a lasting symbol of a different kind of power. One built on fairness, courage, and the belief that every person could serve a cause greater than themselves. April 1946, Tokyo, Japan. The cherry blossoms had begun to bloom again, but their pale petals drifted over ruins instead of gardens. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, mixed with the faint scent of new paint from rebuilt homes. On the streets, American jeeps rumbled past families dressed in patched kimonos, their eyes filled with a quiet mixture of fear and curiosity. For the first time in Japan's long history, women walked beside foreign soldiers, not as captives or servants, but as officers in uniform. Among them were members of the Women's Army Corps, the WACs. They arrived with files, typewriters, and orders, not rifles. Their mission: help restore a nation. Everywhere they went, they brought something Japan had never seen before: calm authority from women who carried both compassion and command. They oversaw ration offices, organized hospital shipments, and trained local clerks. In towns still haunted by hunger, these women represented structure. Proof that the American army was not here to destroy but to rebuild. Many Japanese civilians were stunned by their presence. In traditional culture, women rarely held positions of power. Yet here stood young American officers, some barely in their 20s, giving instructions to men twice their age, and doing it with confidence and respect. At the Tokyo General Hospital, one such officer, Lieutenant Margaret Chase, coordinated medical deliveries to areas struck hardest by famine. Her Japanese assistants, once soldiers themselves, later recalled how she never raised her voice, yet everything she ordered was done without delay. "She treated us like teammates, not conquered people," one recalled years later. "That was the moment I understood the difference between discipline and domination." The U.S. Army's efficiency soon began to inspire imitation. Japanese administrators watched how American women managed food records, how they delegated tasks, how they insisted on fairness. Some of those same systems would later be adopted by Japan's new government departments, especially those handling public welfare and education. It was during this same year, under the guidance of American occupation authorities, that Japan's new constitution was drafted. For the first time in its history, women gained the right to vote. Newspapers described the moment as revolutionary. But for many Japanese citizens, the true revolution had already been visible on their streets, in the form of the calm, capable women in American uniforms. Meanwhile, far from Tokyo, in the countryside near Osaka and Nagoya, former Japanese POWs had begun working under U.S. Army supervision to rebuild bridges and railway lines. These were the same men who, months earlier, had been astonished to see women training beside men in American camps. Now they worked under the same flag, not as prisoners but as partners in reconstruction. One of them, a former engineer named Kazuo Takahashi, later told his grandson, "I learned discipline from the Americans. But I learned humanity from their women." His words echoed a growing sentiment among thousands who had witnessed the quiet strength of America's servicewomen. Back in the States, few citizens fully understood the impact their daughters and sisters were making overseas. To them the war was over, to the WACs, it had simply changed form. They fought now against disease, hunger, and despair, enemies that demanded patience rather than gunfire. Their days began at dawn, organizing supply lists or teaching local nurses modern sanitation techniques. At night, they wrote letters home, describing what they saw: children chasing after army trucks, farmers bowing in gratitude, Japanese women timidly approaching them to ask about education. In one letter preserved at the National Archives, an American corporal wrote, "Every time I teach a Japanese woman to read a new English word, she smiles like it's a treasure. That smile is why we came." The U.S. Army had achieved what few militaries in history ever managed, winning not just a war but the hearts of a people they had once fought against. Through fairness, order, and discipline, they were showing that strength did not always wear armor. By late 1946, new schools had opened under U.S. guidance. Women taught mathematics and English, sometimes using donated textbooks shipped from California classrooms. Former POWs volunteered as translators. The irony was not lost on anyone. The same men who once resisted American forces were now helping rebuild their country, under the direction of American women. It was a story few could have imagined just 1 year earlier. In a world where so much had been destroyed, the U.S. Army had found a way to build something far greater: trust. And in that fragile trust lay the first true foundation of post-war peace. February 1947, Yokohama, Japan. The snow melted slowly that winter, revealing a city that had changed more in 2 years than in the previous century. Wooden houses rebuilt from rubble stood beside telephone poles carrying new lines. Children played baseball on fields once marked by bomb craters. In their hands were gloves and bats, all donated by American soldiers. But the most remarkable change wasn't in the streets, was in the schools. Under the guidance of the U.S. Army's Occupation Command, Japan's education system was undergoing a complete rebirth. Gone were the old texts that glorified obedience without question. In their place came lessons about fairness, civic duty, and cooperation. For many, the most surprising teachers weren't Japanese at all. They were American women in uniform. Inside the classrooms, the sound of English blended with Japanese phrases. Women from the Women's Army Corps and American Red Cross stood before rows of students, teaching not just a language but a mindset. They spoke of democracy, of equality, of the idea that every voice mattered. For young Japanese students, these ideas were astonishing, almost unbelievable. Many had grown up believing that silence was honor. Now they were told that questions were courage. One teacher, Captain Eleanor Brooks, became a local legend in Yokohama. She had been a teacher in Kansas before the war and volunteered to join the U.S. Army's post-war mission. Each morning she wrote an English word on the board: hope, truth, respect. She would say it aloud, then ask her students to find its meaning in their own lives. Years later, one of those students, now an elderly professor, recalled, She taught us more than English. She taught us to stand tall. Meanwhile, across Japan, the U.S. Army's Medical Corps, including hundreds of women nurses and officers, launched a massive campaign against malnutrition and disease. The war had left hospitals in ruins and medicine was scarce. Yet American supply ships arrived weekly, carrying penicillin, food, and new training manuals. Japanese nurses were invited to learn from American counterparts. They watched in awe as U.S. Army nurses organized wards, sterilized equipment, and handled emergencies with precision. One Japanese nurse described it simply: "They were calm even when we panicked. They showed us what discipline with compassion looks like." That phrase, discipline with compassion, became a quiet symbol of the new relationship forming between the two nations. Even former prisoners of war began to speak openly about what they had witnessed. In small community meetings, ex-soldiers shared stories of the camps, not of cruelty but of surprising humanity. They spoke of American women who worked beside men, who treated their injuries, who spoke to them not as enemies but as people. One former POW, Masaru Endo, stood before a crowd in Kyoto and said, "We thought strength meant silence. But the Americans showed us that strength can speak softly and still be obeyed." The audience, mostly widows and workers, nodded in agreement. It was the kind of statement that would have been unthinkable before the war. In those years, the U.S. Army maintained one of the most disciplined occupations in world history. Strict codes of conduct ensured that soldiers treated civilians with fairness and restraint. General Douglas MacArthur himself wrote, "The eyes of the world are upon us. Let our actions prove America's greatness through mercy." His orders were followed precisely, and often it was the women of the U.S. Army who embodied that message most clearly. They organized orphanages, reopened hospitals, and even held small concerts to lift morale. In the city of Sendai, American women hosted an open-air Christmas celebration in 1947, giving toys and food to hundreds of local children. Japanese newspapers captured the moment: U.S. Army women laughing with children once taught to fear them. To many observers, that image said more than speeches ever could. By 1948, a quiet admiration had grown among the Japanese people. While some still carried scars from war, they could not deny what they saw every day: a disciplined, efficient, and fair-minded military that used its power to heal rather than dominate. When elections were held that year, women across Japan lined up to cast their votes for the first time. Many of them had learned to read through English lessons organized by American female officers. Some even arrived at polling stations wearing second-hand U.S. Army jackets, a gesture of respect for the women who had taught them. One reporter from the New York Times wrote, "The truest victory of the United States in Japan is not military, it is moral. It is seen in the faces of children who now see American soldiers as protectors, not conquerors." And among those protectors were the women who once trained beside men as equals, the same sight that had once left Japanese POWs speechless. Their example had crossed oceans, transformed hearts, and begun reshaping a nation's future. The war had ended in 1945. But in truth, the rebuilding of humanity, led by the discipline and mercy of the U.S. Army, had only just begun. June 1948, Tokyo Station. The morning sun glimmered over the steel beams of the half-rebuilt station, casting long shadows on the crowd gathered below. Trains rumbled once again through the heart of a city that had once been nothing but ruins. Merchants sold rice balls beside American trucks, and schoolchildren carried books printed with both Japanese and English words. It was a new Japan, one quietly reborn under the steady hand of the U.S. Army. By now, the American occupation had become a familiar presence. The fear that once filled the air had faded, replaced by a strange sense of partnership. Japanese families waved at American soldiers, and American officers greeted them back with polite bows they had learned out of respect. But what continued to surprise everyone, even after 3 years, was the sight of women in uniform commanding that respect with equal authority. Among the military staff stationed in Tokyo was Major Helen Carver, a logistics officer known for her tireless energy. Every morning, she walked the length of the rail yards, checking shipments of food and medical supplies bound for northern Japan. At her side worked both American and Japanese clerks, many of them former soldiers or students. Under her guidance, the supply chain ran with precision unmatched by anything seen before the war. Her presence represented more than efficiency. It symbolized the very thing Japanese POWs had once found unbelievable: women leading with discipline and command. And yet, here it was before their eyes, every day. Former Japanese soldiers who once fought against the United States now found themselves working under the same banner of reconstruction. Some saluted American officers without hesitation. Others quietly admitted their admiration for the orderliness, punctuality, and fairness the U.S. Army demanded of its personnel, men and women alike. One former naval officer, now a station manager in Yokohama, said during an interview with a local paper, "I used to think the American Army's strength was its weapons. Now I see it is their unity. Every soldier, man or woman, moves with the same purpose." The American women stationed across Japan had become unofficial ambassadors of that unity. They ran supply depots, taught English in the evenings, and organized volunteer drives for orphanages. It wasn't uncommon to see an army jeep stop along a country road as a female officer stepped out to help villagers repair a bridge or unload sacks of wheat. In those small acts, the spirit of America spread, quiet, steady, and unstoppable. By late 1948, the results of the U.S. Army's disciplined occupation were clear. Japan's food production had doubled, schools were full again, and new industries began to open. American advisors, both men and women, were helping shape everything from public health to city planning. And something even more profound was happening: friendship. The children who once stared at U.S. soldiers with fear now ran toward them with laughter. They practiced English phrases like, "Good morning," and "Thank you," learned from American teachers. Families began inviting soldiers to small community dinners, serving rice and tea as tokens of gratitude. To many Japanese, the presence of American women in the Army had transformed the image of power itself. Power no longer meant shouting orders or enforcing fear. It meant discipline, kindness, and consistency, qualities they saw every day in the U.S. military's conduct. When the first democratic local elections were held that year, hundreds of Japanese women voted proudly, many for the first time. Some had been educated by American Army programs. Some had been treated by U.S. military nurses. And some were inspired by simply watching American women serve confidently beside men, something they once thought impossible. A Japanese newspaper, the Mainichi Shimbun, wrote an editorial in November 1948 titled, "The Face of Freedom." It read, "The uniform of an American woman officer represents something more than authority. It represents a civilization that believes respect is strength." That line spread across the nation like a quiet wave. Meanwhile, back in the United States, reports from Japan began to capture the world's attention. Foreign correspondents wrote of how the occupation, led with unmatched discipline by the U.S. Army, had turned an enemy into a partner. The success was so great that military academies began studying it as a model for peacebuilding. The transformation of Japan was no longer just a political story, it was a human one. American and Japanese workers built bridges together, both real and symbolic. POWs who once sat behind barbed wire were now supervisors in new factories built with U.S. assistance. Children who had grown up hearing air raid sirens now waved at passing American jeeps with joy. And in every scene of progress, one could find the steady presence of American women in uniform, leading, teaching, organizing, and reminding everyone that true strength was measured not in weapons but in will. The Japanese POWs who had once been shocked by women training beside men would never forget what they saw. Years later, many of them told their grandchildren, "That was the day I realized America's power came not from fear, but from faith in its people." By the spring of 1949, the cherry blossoms returned once again. But this time they fell over a nation that was no longer broken. Japan was standing again, disciplined, reformed, and guided by lessons learned from those it once called enemies. The U.S. Army had achieved the impossible. It had won the peace as completely as it had won the war. And at the heart of that victory stood the women who trained beside men, and proved to the world that equality was America's greatest weapon. April 1950, Tokyo. 5 years after the war's end, the city no longer looked like a wound. Streetcars rattled past neon shop signs, children carried lunchboxes instead of rations, and the hum of construction replaced the silence of loss. From the top floors of the rebuilt Daiichi building, the American flag still waved beside Japan's rising sun banner. Two nations that had once faced each other as enemies, now working side by side. Below that flag, the last units of the U.S. Army's occupation forces prepared to depart. Among them were women whose service had transformed the meaning of victory itself. They packed their duffel bags quietly, leaving behind classrooms, hospitals, and friendships that would outlast any treaty. Major Helen Carver stood again on the platform at Tokyo Station, the same station she had helped reopen 2 years earlier. Around her were Japanese railway workers, now dressed in crisp new uniforms. They saluted her as she boarded the departing train. She smiled and returned the salute, knowing that discipline, once imported, had taken root here for good. Across Japan, similar farewells played out. Villagers brought flowers to the American women who had taught them medicine and language. Children waved handmade flags stitched with the words "Thank you, America." For the Japanese who had lived through the dark years, these moments were more than gratitude. They were proof that compassion could rebuild what bombs had destroyed. In the city of Hiroshima, a small ceremony took place in a rebuilt school. Former Japanese POWs stood beside American officers, dedicating a new library filled with books donated by U.S. soldiers and their families. One of the former prisoners stepped forward to speak. "I was captured in 1944, he said softly. "I expected cruelty. Instead, I was treated with fairness. I watched American women work with men as equals. I could not understand it then. But today, when I see Japanese girls reading beside boys, I finally do." His words drew quiet applause, and a U.S. Army band played a gentle hymn, not of victory but of peace. That same year, 1950, the world faced new tensions on the Korean peninsula. American and Japanese cooperation took on a new importance. Japanese factories, rebuilt with U.S. aid, supplied equipment to American forces, and once again women worked shoulder to shoulder in production lines and offices. What had once seemed impossible had become normal. American military advisors who stayed in Japan wrote home about the transformation they witnessed. "This country learned discipline the way a soldier learns endurance," one colonel wrote. "They studied it from us, but they've made it their own." In Washington, newspapers praised the success of the occupation as one of history's greatest post-war achievements. But behind the statistics and speeches was a quieter story, the story of how women in uniform had shown the world another kind of strength. They had carried not rifles but notebooks, not commands of domination but lessons of cooperation. They proved that order and empathy could coexist, and that even after war, duty could serve peace. By 1951, Japan had rejoined the global community. Its citizens elected leaders under a democratic constitution that guaranteed freedom of speech, religion, and equality before the law, principles reinforced every day during the U.S. Army's presence. When a group of American veterans returned to visit that year, they were greeted not with fear but with open arms. A parade marched through the streets of Yokohama. American and Japanese flags fluttered together, and among the honored guests were several women who had served in the occupation. The crowd cheered them as symbols of friendship. One former POW, now a school principal, presented a bouquet to a U.S. Army nurse and said, "You healed our bodies. But more than that, you healed our spirit." By the early 1950s, the partnership between the United States and Japan had grown into one of mutual respect. The Japanese press often referred to the period between 1945 and 1952 as the years of discipline and rebirth. The U.S. Army was remembered not just as a force of victory, but as a force of order and hope. For the American women who had once trained beside men and shocked their prisoners with courage, it was a vindication. They had proven that equality could be as powerful a weapon as any gun. Their story echoed far beyond Japan, inspiring reforms across Asia, and even influencing how the U.S. Army itself integrated women permanently into its ranks. On a quiet morning in 1952, the occupation officially ended. The last American flag was lowered over the Supreme Command building. But the spirit of what the U.S. Army had built, discipline, justice, and partnership, remained in the streets, in the schools, and in the hearts of millions. As Japan stepped into a new era, former soldiers, teachers, and nurses from both nations looked back on those years not as a tale of conquest, but as a shared chapter of humanity. The Japanese POWs who had once been shocked by female soldiers training beside men had witnessed a truth that reshaped their world, that respect and equality were not weaknesses, they were the ultimate strength of a free people. And as the cherry blossoms bloomed once more over Tokyo, their petals carried the whisper of a lesson that would never fade. Power can destroy, but only discipline and compassion can rebuild. That was the victory of the United States, and the gift it left to Japan.